So it's basically the same process, except you kind of want to break it down by each position. You go over some key stats and think about, are these numbers too high, too low, etc. The biggest thing is making sure that you're positionally aware. Your VPIP, should be increasing by the later position you get to. So obviously you're going to be playing a lot more hands on the button than early position. So definitely looking here, how often we're raising when in an unopened pot. Definitely increases. Between early and middle, it's a bit, range is pretty similar. I guess you can't really complain too much about that. Perhaps we're playing a bit too many from early position. 17% is not terribly loose, but if you look at 17% and how often we're folding a 3-bets at 71, again, looks like we're not really willing to defend enough of the time when we open under the gun, so that's something that a good opponent will start to pick up on and start to 3-bet us fairly late from later position. And so it's just important to think about how exploitable you are and if your opponents are going to exploit that. Looking at win rates too, theoretically your win rate should kind of take the same path. They most likely should expand as they get to later position, just because position is such an important advantage. And it's 20,000 hands for each plot. It's kind of tough to nitpick between two points here, but it's a pretty good pattern there. Definitely, you're almost certainly going to be losing in the small blind and big blind. It's important to make sure that you're not losing by more than you should be. For instance, in the small blind, if you think about if you fold every single small blind, your win rate would be negative 50. And if you fold every big blind, your win rate would be right around negative 100. Sometimes you'll get a walk, so it wouldn't necessarily be negative 100, but so you just want to make sure you're significantly better than negative 50 in the small blind and negative 100 in the big blind, which we are here, so that's not too bad. Again, kind of the same things. Make sure you're 3-betting enough. Certainly you're going to be 3-betting less from the middle position, just because you're going against a stronger range from early position, more from the button versus cutoff, etc. Again, 3-bet fold, you want to kind of keep an eye on that. It looks like on the button, we're opening a ton from the button, opening 62% when it's 63% when it's folded around to us, which is fine. You just want to make sure that since we are folding 70% of the time, it's important to make sure that we still, the bottom of our range here is still going to be a plus EV, because 62%, it's some pretty weak hands. If you just look at, generally speaking, 63, it's pretty wide, and it's most likely going to be these suited hands and maybe not some of these unsuited hands, but some of these hands just aren't going to be that playable, the 10-4 suited, etc. And so if your opponents are aware that you're folding 70% of the time, most likely the small blind and the big blind will increase their 3-betting range. So if their normal 3-betting range from small blind versus steal is like 8, if they're the player that adapts to players, they're most likely going to be increasing that to like 10, 11, 12, maybe even 15% of their hands. And so what looks like it might be a profitable steal because you think they're going to be folding a lot, if they're adapting versus you and expanding their ranges, you actually might find yourself in some losing spots with the bottom of your range here. So that's something to be aware of, and that's something you can start to filter for when you're on the button and you steal. Try and get a sense of how often people are playing back at you, and if you think that they're playing back at you more than what their stats might indicate. Same thing. Versus 4-bet fold. You want to make sure you're not folding too many 4-bets. And like I said, you don't want to be. I said the upper 50s is probably folding too many 4-bets. As you can see here, it looks like when we 3-bet people and we're in position and they 4-bet us when they're out of position, it looks like we're folding a decent amount. So looks like our button 3-bets might not be that effective versus someone that is capable of catching on versus, because they'll start to widen their four-betting range out of position. And it looks like we might not have as many profitable three-betting spots as we might have thought, because we'll start folding to more four-bets. By the same token, 5-bet folds, I said probably over 50 is kind of where you want to be a bit concerned about. We're 62 on the button, pretty solid everywhere else. The button's pretty high, so it means basically, we open small blind 3-bets and we 4-bet, and they've got a pretty profitable shove, and that's not really a good thing for us to advertise, just because I think the button open, small blind 3-bet, button 4-bet invites a lot of small blind or big blind shoves, just because they're aware that the button opening range is the weakest. So I think you're basically, when you do 4-bet air on the button, you're probably going to be facing a shove a lot of the time. So a lot of the times you 4-bet air on the button, you might not be getting your opponent to fold as often as required, and you might be making some minus EV 4-bets on the button. And so that's important to think about. Again, it's hard for someone to break down your stats by position and see, okay, this is what you're folding by position, just because one, most HUDs just don't have that in real time. It's something they'd actually have to look at, after a session analyzing your game, and two, they would just need a lot of hands on you, and they most likely wouldn't have enough information to get a real accurate read on how often you're folding. It's just something to keep in mind and be aware that because you're folding this much, it might indicate that your 4-betting range contains too many bluffs on the button. But again, it's just completely dependent on how often you think your opponent is folding to 4-bets. And if they are folding enough, then you might have some plus TV spots there. So yeah, that's pretty much, gives you an overall idea of positional advantages, and so it's important to think about how you're playing from each spot, and if you're maximizing your EV from each spot. And overall, you might not have any leaks, but you might have certain leaks by position, and so it's important to be aware of that.